we live in a country where it's not okay to say hateful things about Jews in public, right? We got the First Amendment, but when it comes to hate speech, that's where it stops. And I guess my fear is, will that continue to be rolled back? Over the course of these next years, will we experience a country where hate speech is not just no longer frowned upon, but just sort of ignored? Right? That leads to a completely unsafe situation for not just the Jewish community, but for any community that feels vulnerable, that's a minority that have, for some reason, folks that hate them. And so we try to be very vocal about these situations, because if we can be vocal now, then we hope that that's enough to prevent it in the future.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Our guest is the rabbi from Congregation Beth Shalom, Abram Goodstein. Rabbi Goodstein was raised in Anchorage, where he graduated from Service High School. After graduating from rabbinical school, he moved back to Anchorage, where he has served as rabbi at Beth Shalom, home to the largest Jewish community in Alaska, for over 7 years. Today, we're discussing the Washington Post article republished in the Anchorage Daily News yesterday afternoon. The title is U.S. Coast Guard Will No Longer Classify Swastikas and Nooses as Hate Symbols by Tara Copp and Michelle Borstein. Rabbi Abram Goodstein, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, happy to be here.
Thank you. So the reason why we're here today is because of this Washington Post article in the Anchorage Daily News from about 4 hours ago. The headline is U.S. Coast Guard will no longer classify swastikas and nooses as hate symbols.
Yes. This freaks us out for a couple of reasons. The first one is, of course, a swastika is, in our minds, always and consistently a hate symbol. So to reclassify it as something other than that is, I think, horrible for the Jewish community and for the service people who work for the Coast Guard. And it's important that they feel safe. But there's a bigger problem here that maybe people aren't thinking about. And that is, unfortunately, there are people with hate in their heart. It's irrational, it's illogical, but they hate the Jewish community. And when they see a national headline like this, it empowers them, it gives them permission to show that hate in the public sphere. And really, the only thing that protects Judaism, if you will, is the fact that it's not okay to show that hate in the public sphere. But as soon as a national headline comes out like this, then the people with hate in their heart, they see that headline and they celebrate that. And so this is why we find this so chilling, is because literally this headline makes every Jewish person in our country just a little bit less safe.
I want to talk about the policy itself. The Hill
Yes.
is already reporting that the Coast Guard is saying that it's not true. However, if you go to the Washington Post and click on their version of the article, they actually have an excerpt of the Coast Guard policy from 2023.
Yeah.
And they can compare it to the new policy from November 2025. A swastika being displayed constitutes a potential hate incident. The way it's worded in 2025 is it says that a swastika is a potentially divisive symbol.
Yeah. So what I don't really understand is what is the impetus to reclassify such a famous and well-known hate symbol? Why even go this far in changing the policy to that word potentially in the first place? What does the Coast Guard get from that policy change?
A little bit of history that goes into in the article that on Trump's first day in office, he fired the Coast Guard Commandant, Admiral Linda Fagan.
Yeah.
And that was one of the first things he did. It was
that.
because of her focus on diversity initiatives and her handling of sexual assault investigations. And he put in place Admiral Kevin Lundy, who is the person who's actually quoted in The Hill as saying that this entire story is false. But one of the first things that Lundy did suspended the Coast Guard's hazing and harassment policy. And when he suspended that Coast Guard hazing and harassment policy, that guidance that was being suspended included explicitly that the swastika was a symbol whose display, presentation, creation, or depiction could constitute the hate incident. In other words, for the last 11 months, this guidance has been suspended. So they're basically reinstituting a new version today, calling it potentially divisive. I'm just trying to get myself up to speed.
Just processing it. And this guy has not been confirmed yet.
Correct. So he was in a Senate confirmation hearing on Wednesday. Today is Thursday. He's due to meet with lawmakers Thursday, per the reporting in the Washington Post.
And so I guess someone who's not confirmed can still make policy changes like this to the Coast Guard.
We see this in Alaska. We have an acting attorney general who's restructuring the Department of Law as we speak.
Okay, I did not know that. Wow. Wow.
Yeah. Anyway, there are other changes. The new Coast Guard policy limits the amount of time that service members have to formally report the display of a noose or swastika.
But why limit the time?
Right. The old version was that they should do it as soon as they can.
Yeah.
But in the same way that the Navy deploys for several months, the Coast Guard can deploy for several months. So it's possible that someone could be on a ship out at sea, this incident could happen, and because they don't get back within 45 days, that could delay their ability to report this incident.
Oh, so I see.
The new policy is likely going to make it more difficult to report these sorts of incidents. But they're making it more difficult to report. They're not arguing with that part.
Just because they don't like Jews? Like, what is the logic or the reason for this change?
Per the reporting, previous guidance was put into place in 2019, and that was because a Coast Guard officer, Lieutenant Christopher Hassan, was charged with plotting a large-scale attack on Democratic lawmakers, including then Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi.
Okay.
When they secured his conviction, prosecutors had evidence showing that he was an avowed white nationalist, and I assume that means having displayed some of these symbols.
Yes.
And so that policy was in place. The report goes on to talk about how the changes to the swastika and noose classification were part of a broader effort by the Coast Guard to remove the concept of hate incidents from its regulations.
To remove the concept of hate regulations?
Yeah. And quoting from the article, the terminology hate incident is no longer present in Coast Guard policy. They no longer have that terminology hate incident.
Wow.
And they believe it's in response to Hegseth's directive.
Okay, but Hegseth is DOD.
Correct. So they're talking about these sorts of policies being changed in the DOD, and they're in concert with changes happening at the Coast Guard.
But how come the Coast Guard's the one that we're talking about now and not the DOD?
I think, as you pointed out, because the admiral is up for confirmation. I think that's probably
timing,
why.
Yeah.
Interesting. They're pointing out that swastikas, the word appears specifically in Coast Guard guidance. It does not appear in Air Force or Army guidance. Their current policy prohibits, quote, knowingly displaying paraphernalia, words, or symbols in support of extremist activities or in support of groups or organizations that support extremist activities such as flags, clothing, tattoos, and bumper stickers.
Okay, so swastikas are specifically mentioned in Coast Guard.
It's more general in the Air Force and the Army.
Maybe that's why we're talking about Coast Guard.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is very problematic for us.
Yeah.
But this happened 11 months ago.
Correct.
And we didn't know about it.
And I think this is an issue of where it might have been sort of like not the goal of their freezing the hazing policy. Their goal wasn't to remove swastikas as a
hate symbol.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think their goal, and this is just my interpretation of Pete Hegseth's speech at Quantico on September 30th.
Yes.
That leaders were being hamstrung by not being allowed to be toxic leaders who lashed out at their underlings.
Of course. Yeah.
They wanted to allow more bullying and harassment because that's more manly. And so by freezing that policy, they inadvertently froze the swastika section, and now they've rewritten it in a problematic way by, I think, allowing some nuance there that it's possibly not divisive and Look, it just seems like it's all part of one big piece, that there are folks like Secretary Hegseth who believe that you want to have a more traditionally masculine military. You don't want a bunch of wusses who are just going around and reporting each other for having divisive symbols.
Yeah. Wow.
I don't know.
The fact that this headline is now national news is harmful for the Jewish community. And we are looking to understand what's going to be the response to this. I know that already the DHS has denied this, but it's written in their policy. I don't know how they can deny that.
It's obviously a story in flux.
Yes, of course.
From looking at the Washington Post website at this moment in time on Thursday afternoon, they're standing by their reporting and they're actually posting the changes in language to justify their reporting. And like I said, even if you don't talk about the actual new use of the word potentially divisive, the change in the reporting requirements seems to have a chilling effect on people's ability to report this type of incident. Removing the terminology hate incident. How can you report a hate incident if there's no such thing as a hate incident, if they no longer have that category? Yeah. Can you speak more generally just about your concerns about our country?
What I find really fascinating is this. So the Republican Party essentially told the Jewish community, look, we're very pro-Israel. You should join us, right? Because that's what you're into. That's what we're into as well. And yeah, I would say there's a lot of pro-Israel folks in the conservative arena, if you will. And furthermore, like they're telling us, and they're not wrong, that there's now this left anti-Semitism occurring. And that's correct. That is happening. And so it could push the Jewish community more towards the right and more towards conservatives. But then this stuff happens, right? We have this experience where the Coast Guard, which is being run by a Republican administration, is now saying that a swastika is no longer a hate symbol, but potentially divisive. That feels anti-Semitic to us, right? And so it doesn't feel genuine to say we're pro-Israel, so you should join us, and then say, but swastikas are only potentially divisive. That gives us like whiplash. What is that? Actually, and this kind of reminds me, yesterday there was an article about an anti-Semitism task force, I think by the White House, who cut ties with the Heritage Foundation because Heritage Foundation supported Tucker Carlson, who interviewed Nick Fuentes, who is a famous and like well-known anti-Semite. In the article, the anti-Semitism task force said that, oh, now we have an emergent problem on the right. The right has always had a Nazi problem. And the Jewish community has received that problem for, I don't know, decades, if you will. And even here in Alaska, a lot of the anti-Semitism that I respond to is often Republican politicians. This is where I get really frustrated. Where do us as Jews go, right, when it comes to our political home? There's a joke that you have two Jews, you got three opinions. So we feel strongly about things, but we often don't agree on things, and that's fine, that's great. But it's hard to find like a home that represents our interests when groups that claim they do also have instances where it feels like they don't.
When you talked about the pitch from the Republican Party being, we love Israel, come vote for us.
Yeah.
Is it possible to be critical of Israel and not be anti-Semitic?
100%. Is it possible to be critical of the U.S. and not be anti-patriotic? It absolutely is, right? And we can go down the sort of the rabbit hole of Zionism, but the reality is that you're allowed to critique the thing that you love. And so you can love Israel and still be critical of the government, for example. But I was happy that the Republican Party claimed that they were pro-Israel, and I was happy that the Republican Party claimed that they have a home for the Jewish community. And of course, not all Jews are going to go for it, but if Jews feel safe in that environment, great. It's great for Jews to feel safe. But we don't feel safe when an article or a headline comes out like this and it discombobulates us and we don't know where we stand with the Republican Party anymore when something like this comes out.
In the headline and throughout the article is also discussion of nooses as hate symbols, specifically at the Black community. And in fact, the article concludes by talking about specific incidents with nooses in the Coast Guard that drew national attention in 2007. And so I think in the same way that this is leaving the Jewish community being like, where do we stand? I think you could argue that the exact same questions are happening of African Americans.
Absolutely.
They're saying that this is okay.
Yeah. I think it was also Confederate flag was also mentioned in that article as well.
Confederate flag was mentioned. It's interesting. And again, I'm just processing all this information, but apparently Confederate flags are still banned.
Oh, okay.
Again, I encourage folks to go read the article for yourself, fact check me on that. But it was a little bit more nuanced, like this is not allowed, but it had a little caveat in there. Ultimately, the sad part is that this headline didn't surprise me. It felt like something that's been brewing for a while. And the same way that I think a few years ago, folks had said that Nick Fuentes would never have a place in the Republican Party, and he seems to have grown in influence and to be platformed by people like Tucker Carlson and to have more of an influence as time goes by rather than less, when it felt like in the zeitgeist that he would have less influence. There was the famous
dinner,
with Kanye West.
And President Trump got in trouble for that, essentially got trouble for that dinner.
And Trump distanced himself, said he didn't know him.
Yeah. Yeah. This is just such troubling development for the Jewish community. And we Jews, we have this generational trauma because our ancestors experienced situations where a government that was supporting them one day, almost the next day, was not. Like, my ancestors are from Lithuania, and they came to the U.S. They fled Lithuania because of the pogroms there, right? So this triggers us because we believe in this country. We are Americans. We love democracy because it protects us. And so when we experience things like this, we're wondering, will it get worse? Will the DOD decide that swastikas are no longer a hate symbol as well? How far does this go? Because we're going to go all the way historically. And so once again, it's a question of where are we in this journey and what role does the Jewish community play when it comes to these arguments?
Yeah. At the same time that this is happening, did you see the article yesterday about the guy who got fired because he had
the FBI agent?
Yeah, FBI. Yeah. I guess he was a junior agent in training or something, who had a pride flag on his desk. On the one hand, we're softening our bans on swastikas and nooses while absolutely enforcing that a pride flag will get you fired.
Yeah, I guess that's where we're at. And the Jewish community relies heavily on the FBI. The FBI is an incredible agency that we absolutely love. And the thing with the FBI is that for all the anti-Semitism that you hear about, they're dealing with that we don't hear about. I don't even know how often they've helped prevent anti-Semitism from occurring, even in our own state. Reporting
out of the New Yorker today is that 25% of FBI agents have been redirected to work with ICE for illegal immigrants.
I actually called the FBI when I heard that, and I was freaking out. And I was like, what about public safety? Public safety is our number one concern. Are you helping with public safety? And they claimed that they were, that their resources were still very strong and the priority was public safety. But I worry.
And according to the New Yorker reporting as well, there's a new question. FBI agents do a polygraph test, and there's a new question about, will you be loyal to the FBI director, Kash Patel?
Yes.
That is a new question that had not been there before. Their loyalties to the law, to the Constitution, not to the director of the FBI.
Yeah.
So I believe that is problematic.
Yeah, especially if they lower their standards.
They got rid of the college degree.
Yeah,
as a requirement.
Yeah, just to find more folks who are loyal to the director over being loyal to the Constitution. That's very problematic for the Jewish community, right? Because we want the most fit folks to be FBI agents.
So you mentioned earlier that for your people, this is a trigger, and you wonder if things are going to get worse.
Yeah. I can't even picture what worse could look like because I could never picture this would be happening today. It's always such a surprise. But like I mentioned before, we live in a country where it's not okay to say hateful things about Jews. And in public spheres, there's this culture of, no, hate speech, not okay. We got the First Amendment, but when it comes to hate speech, that's where it stops. And I guess my fear is, will that continue to be rolled back? Slowly, one incident at a time, but over the course of these next years, will we experience a culture or a country where hate speech is not just no longer frowned upon, but just sort of ignored? right? That leads to a completely unsafe situation for not just the Jewish community, but for any community that feels vulnerable, that's a minority, that have, for some reason, folks that hate them. And so we try to be very vocal about these situations, because if we can be vocal now and show our distress and our alarm now, then we hope that that's enough to prevent it in the future.
Rabbi Abram Goodstein, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
I wish I could be on the podcast for better circumstances.
Thank you. After recording and editing the podcast, there was an update posted by one of the authors of the Washington Post story, Tara Copp. I will read her tweet from about 8 p.m. on Thursday night. Late this evening, the Coast Guard published a new policy dated November 20th that reestablishes swastikas and nooses as hate symbols, not as just, quote, potentially divisive, end quote, and states that they are expressly prohibited. Importantly, it says the new guidance published tonight would supersede any other policies out there. So that's good news. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@aklight.gov or call 907-269-0123.